Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Lynne Tillman. We'll be chatting about her latest book, MOTHERCARE, on obligation, love, death, and ambivalence. Published by Soft Skull, it'll be released on August 2nd. Lynne's previous novels include her acclaimed sixth, Men and Apparitions. Her short stories include, amongst others, Someday This Will Be Funny, Tell Me About It, and The Complete Madam Realism. Her essays include What Would Lynne Tillman Do? And she's also written a lot about Andy Warhol, which is fascinating. So, MOTHERCARE. I guess we all hope we care and will care about our moms. But when something happens, as in Lynne's case, your mother gets a rare diagnosis, sometimes misdiagnosis, of normal pressure hydrocephalus, Lynne and her sisters do what seems to me to be impossible, undertaking an arduous and unthinkable task, while she honestly describes, very honestly, coping with the longtime ambivalence towards her mom and the unexpected, heartbreaking, anxious 11 years of caring for a sick parent. So beware and be forewarned that this could happen to you. And the book provides guidance for that literally morbid task, which gives us a solace of sorts in that Lynne admits very openly that none of us are going to get it right. So welcome, Lynne, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction.
So let me just state this first. This seems to me to be a very deliberate book. It's clear that you thought about every sentence and then thought again after you wrote it down. And then the reader does the same, not because it's obfuscatory. We read the sentence and then stop and go back and read it again. And it's not because it was vague or obtuse, but because it was clear and concise and precise. And thus, it's a process in which the reader's insight, I think, is magnified because you're kind of engaged in the same process internally that the author was. Do I have that kind of right?
You have that right. I mean, generally in my writing, I am deliberate in terms of word choice and syntax. I'm very, I don't sort of rush ahead into a story. The story to me is told by the language I use and how I use it and so on. With MOTHERCARE was a different kind of book for me. I've written essays before, and I consider this an autobiographical essay, not a memoir, because if it were a memoir, I don't think I'd be writing about my mother's medications, you know, just that wouldn't be the subject I would find to write about. But after those 11 years and of learning and pain and anguish and confusion, it's very confusing to be suddenly thrown into a situation that from one day to the next, your mother was an independent character, and then she's completely dependent. And there was no smooth transition. You know, there was no kind of warning that this was happening. It wasn't a slow burn the way Alzheimer's disease is, where you recognize that someone is slowly becoming debilitated in memory and so on. With her, it was very, very, the difference was very quick. So suddenly you are thrust into a situation which you know nothing. You know nothing. And that's, whatever education you've had can only help you understand you know nothing.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Alzheimer's because that's not what she had. And
No.
because you paint these characters so clearly, and sometimes I don't want to use the word judgmental, but if it is judgmental, it's done very objectively as well. So I think maybe a good way to start with the way the dichotomy of the characters is between pleasant, unpleasant, or accessible, unaccessible, would be Dr. A and Dr. Z.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Um, I hope I wasn't judgmental. Of course, I was probably more judgmental of myself in the book. I've never written a book in which I say how I felt about something, but I do it, I hope, unsentimentally. I'm pretty tough on myself, I hope. Uh, I'm I try to be more compassionate to my mother, whom I didn't like. I try to see her good parts uh, in terms of facing things that happened to her. Um, I do make a judgment about couple of the doctors, you know, in terms of how they treated her. Uh, but so Dr. A was the doctor who diagnosed her correctly. Uh, when I first took her to a neurologist, he called me the next day and he said, I think your mother has Alzheimer's. I'll let you know and come back in 6 months. And I knew she didn't, and my sisters and I knew she didn't have Alzheimer's because the symptomology was so different. Again, it wasn't this slow descent or slower descent. So then the object was to find a credible doctor who would diagnose her correctly, would really think about it. And I think in that, my sisters and I became patient advocates. That's where it begins. It begins by not thinking that the doctor knows everything, which is, I think, a very hard thing. I want to trust my doctor. You know, I want to think, yes, if the doctor says, no, this is not cancer, I want to say, yes, I trust that. But sometimes you really have to use your own, the evidence that's before you. And I think all of my sisters and I were all educated. We were able, I think, to come up against doctors. And I think a lot of people are cowed and afraid to say, but don't you think you could try this? Or don't you think you could try that? So Dr. A was marvelous. Dr. Z, who was her first neurologist, was terrible because he kept telling us there was nothing wrong with her. She didn't have normal pressure hydrocephalus. It was just an aging brain. And that wasn't the case. And the thing that was, Sam, that was so upsetting about it was to discover that there was actually a test to show whether the shunt was working or not, called the Shuntogram, which was a sort of hilarious, like getting a telegram from the shunt, a Shuntogram. And it was very, very upsetting. He was so sure. I mean, it's impossible that he didn't know about it because he was the chief of a big hospital in New York, which I won't mention, in his neurology department. And he didn't call for the test to be taken when we said again and again, we think the shunt isn't working. So the arrogance of that doctor was a huge problem.
And the delay, that's what bothered me the most.
Yes.
The delay where she could have not got, phrase it properly, she might not have gotten worse if this Dr. Z, the godlike doctor, hadn't have been so sure and the shunt had been inserted at an earlier time, correct?
That's right. That's right. So, I mean, my husband thinks that I have too much trust in doctors. He, you know, he's much more skeptical than I. But I guess I respect expertise that I don't have when it's coupled with some doubt. You know, when a doctor says to you, I think it's this, I could be wrong. Let's give you a test. let's see. That to me is fair.
There's some humor, but there is humor throughout the book. And
Yeah.
one of the things you just mentioned about your husband is when you say, don't get sick on the weekends.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Well, explain to someone who hasn't read the book why that is.
Well, if you go into a hospital or left there over the weekend, everything is different. Things slow down. Your doctor might not be around. A good friend of mine died over a weekend because her doctor, who would have known what was going on in her, wasn't there. This was in a London hospital. But everything is so much slower. Or don't be let into a hospital when the nurses are changing over, like about 4:30 or something. It's
I'll
you
try to get.
learn these things. So I guess, Sam, this deliberateness of writing it had much to do with my sense that I knew some of the obstacles, and I thought I could let other people know what I had gone through, what others had gone through, my sisters, and that could be helpful. I mean, I'm primarily a writer of fiction, and I love writing fiction. This was a lot easier than writing fiction, I have to say, because the object was there. I knew the parameters of this. I knew the beginning, and I kind of knew the end.
Yeah.
I didn't know how I would be after it, which is why there's a section called postmortem, after she died, after my mother died.
Yeah, and it's funny because you use, actively dying and post-mortem and talk
Yes.
about, I guess, the juxtaposition of those terms. But I would be remiss if, as a bookseller, people say you can't judge a book by its cover, but every single person who comes into my bookstore, as you know, does judge the book by its cover. So, and then the other one is epigraphs, and you have two, kind of at the beginning and then kind of at the post-mortem. We can talk about those, but first the cover.
Should I show it?
Yeah, I just have the galley. Yeah, the cover is great because it shows Griselda, right?
I don't know, but the designer came up with that, and because cats do feature in the book, yes, yeah.
Especially as her last words, which were poignant and also humorous, and you even use the word laugh. That you got to, yeah,
yeah.
Well, so those epigraphs, I always consider those important because I assume the author thought a great deal about them. So if you recall them, I can read them, but if you recall them, if you could talk about the epigraph at the outset and then the epigraph at the postmortem, I can read them too.
Okay.
Well, the first one is, first you give it in Latin and then you translate, the fates lead him who will and drag him who will not. Which one are you?
The second. I did not want to go into that, my mother's dark night. I really did not. And I don't want to tell the listener everything, but I was reluctant to spend this time with her. But I knew I had to, or I felt I had to, because I had a conscience that included the idea that you don't desert a mother who was not caring of you. You don't deliver retribution in that way when somebody is beyond fragile, completely dependent. And so, fate is a funny word, but her fate affected mine. And suddenly I was embroiled in a very difficult situation. It is so difficult. It's more than hospitalizations. It's more than seeing your mother or parent or friend very ill, or not knowing whether the next day she'll have memory or not. You know, it's emotionally and psychologically draining, very, very draining. And you have feelings that some ways you cannot let yourself feel in order to go on. I remember a friend saying to me several times over those years in a phone call, you don't complain about you're doing this so much. And I don't remember what I said to her at the time, but I felt it was useless. You know, complaining didn't make me feel better. Uh, and and I've been in analysis or psychotherapy, you know, for a long time. And complaining is different from trying to understand what you're feeling, which is what psychoanalysis really is about, which is understanding.
No,
And yeah.
I was going to say, as we were talking about before the interview, I was very lucky because my mother and I had a wonderful relationship. We're contemporaries. Our parents, our mothers were contemporaries. Mine was 96 when she died. Yours was 98. So mine was joyous, in fact, and I don't mean to say that like I'm better than you. It just happened to be that way. So the thing about your situation is 11 years. 11 years is like Sisyphus.
Yeah.
In many ways, it was like Sisyphus.
Yes. Yeah. And when I think back, I first started writing it about a year after my mother died. And I was, you know, there was so much to remember, and I had such clear memories. But after about 14 pages, I stopped because I felt I was going to relive it right after it had ended. And so I put it aside for many years till after I wrote Men in Apparitions, and that came out in 2018. And sometime after the book came out, I thought I would go back to it. And then when COVID came along, and we were kind of we were in lockdown up in Hudson, New York, where we have a small house. We normally live in the city, which is where I am now. There was this time of solitude and kind of perfect time in which to write MOTHERCARE. And it's interesting about writing and memory, how the more you write one thing, the more it associates to something else, brings back another fact or detail.
It's funny, in the postmortem section, you provide us a copy, basically a copy of the letter you wrote to Dr. A during a portion of this. And I don't mean this the way it sounds, but I've written letters like that.
Yes.
And I've always thought the doctor must be fascinated by my letter, but I don't think they really are fascinated. And I'm wondering whether my doctor even reads letters like that, because if they did, they'd have to do that all the time. It's like reading your fan mail.
Well, I don't know how many doctors get letters like that. It really depends, because people, again, are so wary, frightened of their doctors in some ways. But Dr. A was amazing. And he was unique. And I discovered other people who have him as a doctor, some other writers I know, actually. And everyone who has him feels blessed in a secular way by having him as a doctor. He really does listen. He is a great diagnostician because he listens. And I think he would have read this letter. I didn't write him a million I wasn't like writing him all the time, dear doctor, can I meet the Beatles? Something something like that.
Well, I hope that here's the one thing I really hoped. I don't know if it happened or not. I hope that Dr. A knew who he was and hopefully will read the book because it's a paean to him and he's a great guy. But I also hope that Dr. Z knows who he is.
I think Dr. Z is dead.
Okay.
Dr. Z, another doctor of mine who actually knew Dr. Z, the doctor I'm seeing now, wonderful person, he said that Dr. Z had been once a very, very good doctor. He said, but as he went on, he said he changed. Something happened to him. And I don't want to attribute it just to age, but it could be many other factors. Who knows what happens in a person's life, why you become bitter or obstinate or
God.
such a kind of dictator or such, you know.
Well, that leads me into, when I use the word judgmental, I kind of meant it and you're disagreeing with me. But when you talk about, and this is where we should go, I guess, is you talk about Frances and the masseuse and other characters. I mean, Frances was a thief, although you say she was just taking things, which is different than being a thief.
Well, hopefully that's not only, I mean, I think Frances is a very complicated woman. And I didn't want to judge her badly, and I wanted to understand her, and part of the book is very much about trying to understand who she was, and then you may be very right. Some readers will think it's judgmental. One reader wrote me and said, God, she was a piece of work. It was, I think the limits of understanding is part of what this book is about. And it was very disturbing to me to discover that I was dealing with one person in a certain way and something else was going on. Maybe many other things were going on in her life and thoughts. And I had no access to that at all.
Well, you give the reader, initially you kind of give the reader a pass and you say, this is my perception. My sisters have a different story.
Right.
And so you allow us, as I guess every writer has to, voluntarily or not, you allow us to form our own opinions of what's going on. But then in the one page where you talk about the lost tooth of, Frances missing her tooth and the fact that she wants you to pay for it. And you're kind of astounded that she would even suggest that. So there are instances.
I was very surprised. I mean, the thing, Sam, is that I didn't know where to put that revelation. I didn't know how to make meaning of it. It was so unusual. It was her expectation was so different from what anyone else I think I would know would accept or believe or something. And so then things like that would happen. And I just wouldn't know what to do with it. See, the thing is that one of the ways in which I took a chance in this book was to be honest, very honest about, I had never read anything that talked about the very complicated relationship between the home care person, the companion, and the family who hires her or him. I'd never read anything about that. And I didn't know what could happen. I was not privy to that relationship ever before. And I think that's one of the important things that I wanted to reveal or write about for others, because it's not a simple thing. It's not like hiring somebody who, to be your IT person in an office, It can get, every relationship can get complicated, but this has complications far, far broader than I would have ever imagined. You just think you're hiring somebody. You just hope they're a nice person and do their job well. You don't realize how enmeshed you become with her or him, and they become with you and your family.
I guess we should harken back.
What?
I was going to say, I guess we should harken back because we haven't really gone too far deep into it, the backstory with you and your mom. And I would start with this one quote that you have that your mom said, your mom was perfect. She was perfect. You weren't. You were a lousy writer. Her short story about Griselda the cat was better than anything you've ever written. But she was even more perfect than Jesus because he was too perfect. How can you deal with a person like that?
I mean, it wasn't easy. She was very. I think she was pretty unloved as a child. I have a feeling that there was not a lot of love in her family, and you probably had to compete desperately for anything, any bit or crumb, I just didn't know. I mean, I was the last child. I didn't know her mother. I didn't know her father. I didn't know my father's father. You come into a situation where you have no sense of who these people are.
You do have generosity is not necessarily the right word, but you do talk about the positive traits she has, like in the situations where there's an emergency. I'll talk about the train. Talk about the train incident.
Oh, that was very interesting. We'd been in Florida. My parents took me out of school for 6 weeks, 2 of which were Christmas holiday. And we went down to Miami Beach and stayed in a hotel. And my father left after 2 weeks. He had driven us down. He loved driving. And this was before air conditioning in the car. It was brutal. It was not as bad as it could have been because it was winter, but still was going through parts of the South. And I used to get terribly car sick. That was terrible those days. I was 8. And so then my mother and I were alone for 4 weeks, which was the only time we've ever had that kind of length of time. And I think she really loved getting up late and letting me do whatever I wanted to do during the day. And at one point we went to see the Hans Christian Andersen movie, and there were books being sold in the movie theater of I don't know, golden books of 10 of his stories or so. So we're on the train coming back, and in Georgia there's a train accident. The train is going too fast. There's a what they call a hot car on the rail that the train conductor didn't miss the flag or whatever it was to warn of an obstacle, and was going 90 miles an hour too fast, middle of the night, and crashed into it. And I awoke. We had a sleeping car. I was on the top bunk, and my mother said, "Lynn, get dressed." And she said, "We have to go get out of the train or get out of the car." She was completely calm. There was not one bit of anxiety. She said, "Lynn, get dressed." And I got dressed. We went outside, got out of the train car. And once we got out, there was a woman screaming, "You're going to get electrocuted. Watch out for the electrical wires." And she said, "Lynn, that woman is hysterical. Don't listen to her." And so I didn't. And that's how she was, about kind of the most sort of many drastic things. She was very about her own illness, even when she was out of it. when she would be clear-headed, she would say, well, if this operation is necessary, let's do it, you know. She was very good in many ways. She was very good medically. She could have been a great doctor. She could look at you and say, there's a spot on your chin. You should have that kind of thing. And she was practical. There were things that I admired about her, definitely. But she was not a kind person. She was not a loving person. She was an angry person. You could say she was of the feminine mystique version of woman who had was very intelligent, could have done many things, and believed she should be a mother and a housewife. But I also was very angry about it, I think.
The two people that you treat with the utmost privacy and don't even go to their, I think, charitably, their positions in this situation are your two sisters, the Carolina sister, the New York sister. How did you come to that determination early on in the writing process?
That they would have a different story from mine, that I didn't want to kind of invade their privacy and didn't want to represent their feelings, which I may or may not know, but it would be from my point of view. And the story wasn't, I don't know, I always forget that Chekhov quote about happy families and unhappy families, but one way or the other, I didn't want to engage with those problems, because every family that's going to take care of a sick parent or cousin or whatever is going to have issues. That's so common. That's not the story I wanted to tell. The story I wanted to tell was what happens when suddenly your mother becomes dependent on you and ill with a peculiar illness and goes through all of these different situations, hospitalizations, good doctors, bad meds, good meds, home care, and so on. It's so complex. That story in itself. And then I found myself writing about my feelings, which I didn't expect, Sam. I didn't expect that I would be interested in that. I'm really not interested in writing about myself. And I don't do that in my fiction, or if I use the I, it's anybody's I, and I have distance from myself when I write. I'm not writing myself, which is why it's a joyful thing, because I do not want to be in myself all the time. And style is very important to me. Establishing the style for that book, establishing the voice, how I would tell the story. So it was the story of my mother's illness. It was the story of my reaction to all of this, and my sisters were involved. And if they wrote this book or wrote a book, they would tell it differently. Maybe not the facts of it, like she had the operation on this day, but very different feelings,
The thing about it is that, notwithstanding that, not to belabor the point, it does seem that during this time period, you worked well as a team with your two sisters.
That's true. That's true. We did have a goal. It was rational, that she had to be taken care of. We had to put aside everything that we might be feeling about each other and work toward this goal of doing the best thing for her. So where did we learn that? How did we learn that? And that's a very interesting question. Many of the things that happened during that period, or just happened all the time, is that your responses to things are shaped very early. I mean, the way you will respond. And I have friends who, I'm thinking of one particular man whose mother, when she became ill, there was huge fights among him and his siblings. A lot of anger toward each other came out, which is often the case. I mean, this is your mother or your father, whether you like them or not. They play a big role in your emotional life. You know, it's kind of the bottom line.
Well, maybe you're giving yourself short shrift in this, because for doing this for 11 years, which is basically 1/7 of a life, it does seem like
Please
love.
don't remind me of that.
I know I didn't want to, because I was projecting that onto me. But it does seem like love. I can't think of what else would allow you, would afford you the ability to do this for such a long period of time, unless there was, other than the fact that you felt an obligation, or you had to do this to be a good person or something like that. It does seem like love. And that's in opposition to what you wrote.
Well, I didn't feel it as love. I felt it as a grueling obligation for the most part.
Why
I
were
mean,
you obligated? Why were you obligated? Because she's your mother? That's it?
I think so. And because I would have left my sisters with even more on their hands, you know. I didn't like any bit of it.
Well,
You know, occasionally when my mother had brain damage, she was much nicer to me. But when, with moments of lucidity, she would be nasty again. So,
well, what about the hardest parts? Without getting graphic, when she went to the bathroom and you had, and it is such a invasion, because it's not supposed to be that way. She's the one who did it for you. And you're doing it for her now. Was that, I guess the first time must have been incredibly hard. And then did you get used to that?
I got more used to it. Yes, as time went on, but it was very weird. I mean,
Yeah.
handling your mother's body uh, is just very strange. It's not just a body, it's attached to your mother, and it's not like there was a huge taboo. It wasn't incest per se, but it did feel the reversal of roles, to put it in a more sociological context, was surprising. You're caring for your mother as if she's a child. It's, you do all sorts of things as a person that you never expect to. And by rights, I should have walked away, given how shitty she had been to me, uh, you know, during my life. But I didn't. I don't think it was love, Sam. I think it was obligation, a sense of responsibility. I mean, I wouldn't do that to a cat. I wouldn't abandon a cat.
Well, but would you spend $5,000 in
I
surgery to save?
did. And 10,000.
Oh my God.
The money that what was left of my share of my mother's money, which was not much, as soon as she died, like, some months later, our cat Louie, well, it's a longer story. I won't go into it, but
Okay.
anyway, he was diagnosed with lymphoma, and he had 6 months to live or something like that. But maybe we could do this or that. I think he did get, well, the chemo pills that he was given, I think created a heart condition, which eventually he died of 3 years later. So there you go. He may never have had cancer.
Medicine is, where you talk about art and science, and
Yes.
yeah, it's difficult to wrap your head around it. The oxymorons that you use, I would disagree with you. I don't think they're oxymorons. I think when you're actively dying, it really is a process and you're working to die. And a living will seems to me to be very actionable. And as I said earlier, a deliberate process in which you decide, I'm going to take a burden off of somebody by doing this.
Well,
So
that
I
may
don't
be
know.
true, but I still think it's an oxymoron to say actively dying.
As an author, yes, you have to. I can't deny that. What about when you stick that quote in the middle about attention? Yeah, attention is the natural prayer of the soul. What exactly does that mean?
Well, I think being exact about it is, but I think each human being, well, I think people really want to be paid attention to. You have friends, I have friends who never listen to you or don't hear what you're actually saying. And you may say something about being heard and they respond talking about their own hurt, without,
Yeah.
recognizing. And so the natural prayer of the soul, the, the, the heart wants to be heard. I think, I don't necessarily I don't believe in the soul in that way, but I believe in the unconscious and the conscious mind. And I think you want somebody to hear you. You want somebody to pay attention to you. And doing that is so important for whomever you're listening to. In American Genius, the comedy, which was the novel before this last one, I write about that, how people like to talk and don't like to listen.
Yeah.
And that came out in 2006. And now there's a lot of discussion, 16 years later, but you hear talk about listening and stuff like that. Because we know all too well the problems of not listening. I mean, a major one was Trump. He didn't listen to what anybody told him. He didn't listen when some of his uncorrupt advisors told him, you have to stop this about January 6th. He didn't listen at all.
There is no civil discourse in our country that I can find today. Very little. Um, you did mention you just did mention about essentially not what happens, intimated about what happens after you die, and you talk about the atheism and agnosticism of your parents. Um, and you touch upon it too, and you talk about, well, maybe you can just say, I'll be exactly like I was before I was born. And a lot of people feel that way.
Right.
And I've always thought of it like, for all eternity, we're swimming through this dark, blue, warm sea. And then we pop up for a minute and go, well, this is cool. And then you just go straight back down because it's only 70 years out of eternity or 80 years out of eternity.
I think eternity is what we're seeing those pictures of, that great telescope is.
Yeah.
It is so hard to conceive of nothing or to conceive of endlessness, that this goes on and on, or maybe it stops and we can't imagine it stopping or can't imagine. And you're right, we have this tiny speck of existence, really. And it's why I'll look at a praying mantis or an ant and think, about its short lifespan, and that they're probably not conscious of that. Although I think elephants have consciousness of death, or at least they know what it is and they return to it, and other animals do too. Yeah, I don't believe in God. I believe that I don't know what's unknown. I just, and I think if I have any spiritual quality it's at all, it is that I would like to help other people to the extent I can in my role. as a writer, as a professor, you
You
know.
know, I don't want to get meta about this, but I didn't think you broke the fourth wall of this, not memoir, but except for one time. And I don't remember the context. I just thought of it where you go, you do, comma, I do.
Mm.
And you talk to the reader for 1 second and you go, you think this, I think this, but I can't remember where it was. It was the
No,
only
neither
time.
can I.
It was somewhere in the middle of the book. That's all I can remember. Where you go, you think you do this, I do this. It was the only time that I remember you doing it.
I'm delighted that you read the book so closely.
Well, for two reasons. One, as a bookseller, I think it's important if you're going to interview someone that it's not like Good Morning America where they go, hey, what's your book about? And that's it. No, I think it's very important that you read it. And second of all, I read it in one sitting because it was a fascinating, really good book. I mean,
Oh, I'm glad you're saying that.
well, it's not really to compliment you. It's just, this is what it
No, I
was.
know,
I'm not,
I know.
yeah.
No, I
And that's
know
not,
it's not just I mean, people are telling me now that the book is, the hardcover is coming out, the finished book, because there were lots of differences in the galleys, um, are coming out, that they are reading it. They can't put it down. And which is wonderful to hear. And I wrote very deliberately, as you know, to go back to the beginning, to make the narrative move along. You know, I've learned that there's a lot of interest in narrative medicine now. There's at Columbia University, there's a department that deals with narrative medicine. And I haven't looked in yet to what they teach and so on, but telling your doctor, when you narrate your story, you go to the doctor, you have to be very careful how you tell your story, because they tend to, if they're listening,
right.
they tend to, yeah, if they're listening, they'll start where you tell them to start. You know, you think it's this, okay, let's do that. Rather than you say, I have this symptom, I have that symptom, I don't know what it is, you know, and then get tested. It's so, I mean, I'm doing it very, a very brief, you know, look at that, saying what narration means to a patient and to a doctor, but it's very, very important.
Yeah. And the other thing about that, and then like, I'll bring that to one other author, is that it's not only the deliberation, it's the fact that some of the book almost reads like Zen koans. It's almost as if you try to eliminate any aspect of emotion from it. And each sentence could almost stand alone throughout the book. And then the corollary of that is when you mention Sherwin Newland and How We Die, because he does the same thing with the actual infrastructure of it.
That's right. That's right. And reading that after my mother died, um, it was because I was so, I'm very curious about things anyway, and I was so curious, having watched my mother die, and you know, you can't kind of, in quotes, unpack this strange event. I mean, I guess it's the way, if I could bear watching a woman give birth, I think I'd faint. But watching someone die, at least watching my mother die, was just, you know, you're just kind of stunned. And you're looking at something that's impossible, you know, that seems impossible. And you're right that actively dying actually is correct in that the body is shutting down actively. It's, you know, it's like turning off the lights in your house, going from one light to the other, not just, I guess, though, if you have an aneurysm, it's just like a circuit breaker going boom, like that. But Newland, so reading Newland's book was his precision on about what everything that happens in the body was just amazing. And yet it doesn't take away
Right.
what dying is, or what it seems like, or how mysterious it is still. And then
That's
I
why.
just watched it. I didn't think to ask my mother anything.
Yeah, that's why I kind of said it was the obverse. That's the other thing. When my mom was dying, even though it was different than yours because we both loved each other so much, and like I said, we laughed and sang until the last day. Um, my brothers and I talked about, I felt kind of guilty because I was so fascinated with the process. And that's something an author would do. And I think you were, as you just said, you were fascinated with the process as well. Did that bother you that
No,
you were?
no, maybe, maybe if I had loved my mother, really loved her, it would have been much more wrenching. But I'm not saying it wasn't. I don't know that I have the capacity to describe what I was feeling, because I was watching something I'd never seen before. And it was a process that defies logic. I mean, there is a logic to it, as Newland says, in terms of what the body is doing. But, that we humans know we will die, and that's our fate, you know, to die and to know that we will die, which I think is very cruel. And I think that's actually what happened with Adam and Eve, that it wasn't about knowledge. It was the knowledge of death, and not it was some kind of knowledge about pain, I think, that they discovered and were
Yeah.
kicked out.
And it's the difference between the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. And that's what
Yes.
God was so scared of. Hey, if they do both, they're pretty much like me,
Yeah.
which is a whole other story. It has nothing to do with selling your book. One thing my mother did say as she got towards the last few months, one day she says, I am failing. And I thought that was so interesting. But because she was who she was, she said it almost whimsically. She was just observing it. And there was no, oh, I can't believe this is happening to me. It was just, I am failing. And she just announced it and then laughed again. Like I said, so yes, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but she was a wonderful person. And that was just part of the process for her. And reading your book, it made me, again, like I said, feel so lucky that I had that. But I didn't mean to be mean to you because you didn't.
No, I don't feel that that's mean to me. I think many people I know have much better relationships with their parents and with their mothers than I did. Um, I don't think it's mean. I'm happy for you that you had that. I think it's wonderful to have that. And I think um, all of the men I know uh, who had loving mothers do much better in life.
Yeah.
The ones with the men I know whose relationships with their mothers, whether they're, successful musicians or writers or not, it's a much more difficult uh, trajectory for them. I think knowing your mother loved you uh, is a gift. And I felt that my father loved me. And I think that had that not been the case, I don't know who I would be. I certainly wouldn't be here.
Well, he was really put upon. He was really put upon by your mom as well. The interesting thing about his death, I was not surprised, but it was interesting that your grief for him lasted such a long time. Your grief for his death.
Yeah, yeah. I really did grieve for him,
Yeah.
and I did not for my mother. And I think if it had been the opposite way, that my father taking care of him for 11 years. There would have been love. I would have felt love.
Well, that's, I guess, kind of as we conclude, I had one more question. So after my mom died, people would come into the bookstore and they would go, "Oh, the usual things they say.
Yeah.
If there's anything I can do, well, yeah, you can bring my mom back, or you can bring me a casserole, and I don't want a casserole."
I want my mom.
Right, exactly. But they would come and say, "I'm so sorry for your loss," and I go, "No, it was great." And it would appall them, but that's how I felt about it. It's just a great thing, a great process. But in any event, the one question I was going to ask is because now that you've gone through that and it's published during COVID still, so now you're going to go back. I assume you'll go back, and maybe you've already gone back to story writing.
Well, I did write stories during this period too, short stories. I am, and it's such a relief from telling this story. I always think there's fiction involved. I have to say that because you can't put events on a page without invention. There are different ways to tell things. I did not want to tell a sentimental, I'm a victim, you had it much easier than I had it kind of story. I really wanted to be more clinical about it. And I think some people might find that difficult, to read. I felt it gave space to the reader. But just to answer your question, so I did keep on writing stories and essays about artists and art stuff and cultural stuff. But I am beginning to think of a novel begun.
I always say it's my last question, and it never is. But because of what you just said about fiction, you're one of the few authors, or any people actually, that gives James Fry kind of a pass, which I do too. Writers are entitled to lie. It's no big deal. And then
I don't think it's a lie. That's the thing. I think it's very complicated. He writes a novel. He's told that by his agent, I can sell it, and by his editor publisher, if you call this a memoir, because it's actually based on quote unquote real events. I would call them actual events.
Like he goes to the dentist. Yeah, when he goes to the dentist. So what?
Yeah. So and I think Oprah has done a lot of good on her show, but I think her reaction to this was a great overreaction and a disservice to writing. Because does it really matter if his girlfriend hung herself or took pills? She killed herself, And when I watched this episode where she goes like that, and I'm thinking, what the hell? Okay, it's a little more dramatic to hang yourself, She killed herself.
Yeah, well, I was really glad you put that in there. It was apropos, perhaps, of nothing, but it really.
My mother kept reading his book.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, and I was surprised at that too. She loved it.
She loved his book.
Okay, Lynne. Well, thanks so much. MOTHERCARE will be on. Well, I can't open. I'm always afraid I'm going to get arrested if I put it out before August 2nd. If we have it in the box, do not open, like a Harry Potter book.
Is that what they say?
Oh yeah, it's like remember those tags on the mattress? Do not remove under penalty of law.
What the hell is that about?
I don't know. Well, there's a state mattress inspector, and what kind of job is that?
Could be very interesting.
I guess so, from time to time, perhaps some kind of menage. But in any event, I'll stop now. And I just wanted to say, yes, the book will be on. Hopefully, I may put it out before August 2nd. I don't want to get arrested, so hopefully there's no mattress inspector listening to this. But in any event, thanks so much for writing it. It was a difficult task, and you handled it with a great deal of aplomb. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for talking to me.
Thank you so much, Lynne.
Bye.